Hello, and thank you for joining me today for this short presentation. Today, I'm going to talk about the cultural construction of gender and the popular misunderstanding of sex. I've chosen this topic for a couple of reasons. Firstly, in my anthropology classes, this is a theme that we often return to in our holistic approach to examining culture. We explore the interconnectedness of various norms and values that are either perpetuated in order to reinforce culture or challenged in order to develop cultural change. And gender is one of those areas that is currently experiencing both challenges and resistance to change. And this ties to the second reason that I wanted to discuss this topic today, and that is our students. In the past 5 or so years, I've witnessed a significant number of our students bravely assert their own true identity. So to these students, thank you, and this today is for you. Western society in the 20th century has demonstrated a somewhat paradoxical approach or fascination to non-Western sexuality and sexual identity. Anthropology, alongside other disciplines, reflected the urge to see other ways of expression, and this other is with a capital O, as Mary Helms identifies. In anthropology, other is always contrasted to the same that is familiar, and so we often look at others with this capital O in contrast to our own familiar norms. So for sex and gender, this other contrasted to what was the same for Western norms and moralities, conforming genders and gender roles, modesty in your sexual morality and preference and disposition. It is no surprise that famous anthropologist Margaret Mead's book, Coming of Age in Samoa, which documents sexuality amongst teenagers in Samoa, became one of the most popular books of its time for the American public in the 1930s and 40s. The assertions in this book have since been greatly challenged, but it is a time capsule of the Western approach and fascination to this idea of non-conforming morality. And so I share with you this triptych by Shiguchi Kihara, a Japanese artist whose work documents Pacific culture, gender identity, and colonialism. She states, "The series is a powerful commentary directed at our Western perceptions of Pacific Islanders and the sexual stereotypes that were generated by early images and which in many ways remain intact to this day. If you take this series of images in 2004 to 5 and compare it with the image on the first slide, Two Leaf-Clad Women by Thomas Andrew in 1905, you can see the similar tone here, the idea of the exotic, the alluring, the slightly kind of exciting, perhaps. Except with this artist's work, she's highlighting the fact that our Western take on that idea of sexuality and sexual identity is very narrow. It's very linear. And if you look through these slides, you'll see that this is a representation of a third gender Pacific Islander. So what are we talking about today? Well, one of the first things I'm talking about is sex identity. This is defined as either of the two main categories, male or female, into which humans and most other animals are divided on the basis of their reproductive function. This is different to gender identity, which is an individual's personal sense of having a particular gender. And we'll be talking about the relationship between biological sex and gender identity for the majority of today's presentation. What I won't be talking about primarily is sexual orientation, a person's sexual preference or orientation. But it is important to say that both sex identity and gender identity have important implications for how we understand sexual orientation. So the first thing to determine is that our binary of gender in the American culture and European culture is well established. These books are all somewhat familiar to us. The idea that what is feminine, what is masculine is a norm and is to a certain extent sort of biologically driven, right? The idea is that, women can't read maps, women communicate like this, men communicate like that, men are more naturally assertive. All of those ideas we often assume are ingrained into our biology, and they're actually not. culture constructs what is a norm for a gender. We see this because gender norms change over time, they change by culture, and then they actually can change in certain contexts. So the phrase gender bending describes when in one situation what is not a norm for one gender is permitted. I'll give you an example. We often see in American football when someone scores a touchdown, it's okay and it's normal for one guy to come along and hit the other guy on his bottom, right? That's not a normally accepted norm for masculine behavior in American culture, but it is okay on the football field. It's accepted on the football field. What we determine to be our cultural norms for gender roles are constructed by the values that we reiterate, share, and repeat to one another. So the more we look at these books and read these titles, the more we believe that female and male gender identities are sort of biologically predisposed or driven to be certain things. But all the research, all the scientific research shows that this is not the case. What we see is that what we are culturally conditioned to believe often drives our attitudes, our habits, our acts. And the important thing here is, as I alluded to in the previous slide, it's also not the case that sex is binary, that biological sex is binary. One of the best authors on this topic of the cultural construction of gender is Cordelia Fine. And from her book here, Delusions of Gender, she says, quote, "When the environment makes gender salient, there is a ripple effect on the mind. We start to think of ourselves in terms of our gender, and stereotypes and social expectations become more prominent in the mind. This can change self-perception, alter interests, debilitate or enhance ability, and trigger unintentional discrimination. In other words, the social context influences who you are, how you think, and what you do." And so it is our cultural construction of gender that is the driving reason for why we have an underrepresentation of young males in early childhood education. It is the driving reason why Lego had to make a set of Lego bricks pink and purple in order to engage females. And it is the driving reason why we have a parliament that is made mostly of white males. Now, this is not the norm across all cultures. The idea of a binary in gender, male versus female, is not the only way that other cultures around the world perceive gender. Many other cultures perceive it as much more fluid, much more complex, and actually representing much more accurately the biological construction of sex. So on the left here, you see all of these different cultural groups and their term for what they have as a third gender, or what is often known as a two-spirit, okay? So everywhere from Tonga to French Polynesia, to India, to Hawaii, to the Philippines, to Italy. We see examples of cultures having an actual term and recognition of a third gender as part of the norm, as part of the accepted reality of life. For example, a Fakeleti in Tonga is a biologically born male, but who is assumed or takes on a female gender identity. As such, represents both male and female in one. And it is often the case that if a mother gives birth to 2 or 3 boys on the trot, then the third male may be attributed as a Fakeleti and be raised as a female. This is because these cultures value a balance between what is seen as male and female genders, and when they are combined into one, these are seen as often very specially attributed individuals. Indeed, back in the late 19th century, Wewa was a Zuni Lamana, this is a two-spirit of the Zuni tribe, and she served as an ambassador to the United States. For about 6 months, she was positioned in DC, and she was an object of curiosity, but not because her gender identity was being questioned, rather that she was representing a female Indigenous American in a political context. So where are we today in America? Well, I think it's fair to say that America is somewhat confused about challenges and resistance to normal quote-unquote gender identities and the relationship between sex and gender. So for example, non-binary gender identity got added to the Collins Dictionary in 2019. And non-binary, gender fluid and pangender identities have had a reawakening in recent years, gaining in large part some mainstream acceptance. But as that has been happening, there's been mainstream resistance to these identities also. To take a quote about Sam Smith from Piers Morgan, and the parentheses here we've substituted they to represent the non-binary approach versus the he that Piers Morgan was using. Sam Smith has announced that they're gender fluid. They can't work out if they're man or female. If 10% of the population decide they are not going to identify as male or female, where does that leave the demographic makeup of this country going forward? End quote. I would say, Piers, it leaves us where we have been for the most recent millennia or two. None of this is new. In addition to popular confusion and resistance, we've also seen increased political resistance to non-binary identities and a challenge to the gender norms of our society. So, in Europe, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán in 2018 banned gender studies within universities, stating, quote, "The government's standpoint is that people are born either male or female, and we do not consider it acceptable for us to talk about socially constructed genders rather than biological sexes." In addition, under the Trump administration in 2018, there was a proposal that the federal government legally define both gender and sex as the same definition, either male or female, unchangeable, and determined by the genitals that a person is born with. What we come back to is this idea that because sex is binary, gender is binary, and any non-conforming gender, therefore, is somehow a practice, a sensation, a desire, but is not real. And what we know is sex isn't binary, and I'm proof of that. So what we're left with is confusion with the distinction between sex and gender, concern about non-binary identities, and increased politicization of personal and complex issues. You're about to see a video, and in this video, it's a montage of different clips that demonstrates these final 3 points here. The politicization of gender identity, the true confusion and conflation of gender and sex as the same thing, and an attempt to draw parameters around gender identities, even if the biological reality is not that. So here we go.
If Donald Trump dresses up as Hillary Clinton, he still can't use the girls' restroom.
It's a basic expectation of privacy that I hear from mom and dads and families, that when their daughter or son goes into a facility, a restroom, they expect people of that gender, of that biological sex or gender, to be the only other ones in that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the expectations that we've had for many, many years, as both you and I have grown up on.
Is the new world champion in the women's 800-meter race really a woman at all?
There's no, scientific, test or anything that can define a human.
Because Sam Smith can't decide if he wants to be a man or woman, male or female, the Brit Awards apparently are considering now scrapping all gendered categories from next year. There'll be no more British Best Female or Male Solo Artist. They'll all be non-binary awards.
Does that reduce them? Does that mean there's just one award? Or will there still be 2 awards?
I don't know.
Okay. So what we see there then, from the North Carolina bathroom bill to the IAAF trying to say that Caster Semenya naturally produces too much testosterone for a biological female, even though that's just what her body does. We see an attempt to draw lines around what is female and what is male and make sure that there's nothing in between. But the truth is that sex isn't binary. Our hormones, which are the fuel for our genetic development, mostly happen in the womb. And then we have some wave of hormone development during puberty. Dr. Anne Fausto-Sterling from Brown University is a leader in this research. And she identifies 5 stages of hormonal development, or 5 layers. 4 of which are in the womb, that help influence our sex identity. And note, none of these 5 layers exist in a binary. For every one of these stages, there's a spectrum between male and female of sex. So, chromosomally, we are either XX female or XY male. But note, there are already other versions of chromosomal sex than that we'll get into. But let's say that we're either XX or XY. Prior to 8 weeks, we're effectively unsexed. All of our fetal genitalia are the same. We are phenotypically female, and it is that wave of male androgens, male sex hormones, that kick in male development after 8 weeks. So fetal, gonadal, and hormonal sex at around 8 weeks of gestation allows the Y chromosome to express, and that will drive male characteristics. Otherwise, the female phenotype drives through. Of course, males and females all express both estrogen and testosterone in their bodies. Internal reproductive sex and external genital sex are the next level of development within the womb. And then finally, at puberty, we get an extra surge of androgens and estrogens. So androgens being the male sex hormone, estrogens being the female sex hormone. And that helps us sort of finish off our sex development, if you like. So every one of these 5 points have variations between what is categorized as sort of categorically male and categorically female. These 5 layers all have sex identity that exists on a spectrum. And then, in addition, you can have chromosomal variations of male and female. And these are intersex examples. So intersex is the term used to describe an individual who doesn't conform to the XX or XY definition of biological male or female. They are born as something in between. They're born as a third sex. So, for example, you could be born with a single sex chromosome, or you could be born with Klinefelter syndrome and have an XXY as your chromosomal identity. Mosaicism is interesting in that different cells in the same body can be either XX or XY. And Swyer syndrome are XY individuals, male individuals, but with vaginas, a uterus, and non-functional gonads. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia are XX individuals, female individuals, but who are exposed to high levels of male sex hormone or androgens in the womb. And then finally, androgen insensitivity syndrome, XY, so male cells, male chromosomes, but with cells that don't receive any androgens. They just don't pick up the male hormone. And as a result, they develop with the estrogen that is going around in the womb, or if they're partial AIS, they may pick up a little bit of testosterone and a little bit of estrogen. So as I stand before you right now, I am CAIS, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. My chromosomes are male. If I leave my blood at a scene of a crime, they're looking for a male. But you could inject me with testosterone right now and I wouldn't change. My cells are dead to androgens, and they always have been. So what that meant was that I picked up the little bit of estrogen in the womb that I had, but that means that I myself don't have a womb, for example. So sex is not binary. It never has been and it never will be, but our culture still wants to construct gender around a notion of binary. And it wants to challenge anyone that says that they don't fit into the gender identity given to them at birth. So ubiquitous is this concern about the gender binary that it's only until very recently, 2020, that 2 hospitals in America have decided against undertaking surgery on young intersex babies and children. These hospitals have said that they'll stop undertaking surgeries until the children are able to determine themselves what they want. For many decades, it's been felt that growing up intersex can do significant psychological harm, and also that there may be potential risks of ovarian cancer, gonadal cancer, things like that. And so what happened is, in the first few years after birth, surgeries were undertaken to make sure that bodies conformed, if needed, to certain biological sexes. And then these children were often not told about this until much, much later. So the Intersex Justice Project is a project that's been spearheaded by some very young intersex individuals, Pigeon Pagonis being one of them, and they've been able to effect this change amongst 2 hospitals in the US to pause on unnecessary surgery until an age where a child is able to determine what it is they want. And here's the complex piece. So we are able to identify intersex individuals because it's about chromosomes and reproductive organs and things like that. But what we don't know enough about is the relationship, the very complex relationship between hormonal development in the womb and outside of the womb and the brain. We know that sex-based differences between male and female are much less categorical than we ever thought. Going back to that book with the slide with the books on, studies have shown that men and women don't think differently. Studies have shown that there isn't this categorical difference in the brain between male and female. But what we don't really understand is how hormones impact and affect the way in which our brain thinks. Some studies of the role of hormones in the brain identify that there's a lot of noise there. So we know how to identify an intersex body, but we don't know how to identify an intersex brain or a non-binary brain. But we should expect that because biology isn't binary, sex isn't binary, we should expect that gender identity isn't binary either. Indeed, the NIH has only recently started to include females in animal-based research. Until this point, all examples were of males and we extrapolated to females. So we were only looking at 1/2 effectively of the population. So to conclude, what am I saying? I'm saying that the intersection of sex, gender, and sexuality is incredibly complicated and largely misunderstood. We do have implications here for sexuality because even our idea of sexuality, of gay and lesbian, is based on an idea of a male-female binary, male and male, female and female. But if sex isn't binary, what does that mean for sexuality? I am not saying that non-binary gender identities are all intersex individuals. We know that not to be the case. Intersex individuals make up about 1.7% of the world's population. We've got far more people who are transgender or in the wrong gender than that. So it's not a case that this is an easy answer to non-conforming gender identity. But what I am saying is that we know sex isn't binary, and therefore we really shouldn't expect gender to be binary either. And that relationship between hormones in the brain is incredibly misunderstood right now, or lackingly understood. In other cultures, non-binary genders are celebrated. So the very fact that we are even kind of obsessed with this is a little weird to me. In other cultures, third gender or two-spirit is part of the makeup of our society. It just is. And if sex isn't binary, as I said, then our cultural categorization for understanding sexuality and sexual orientation also needs revision. As an intersex person myself, I ask you to embrace this diversity and not to judge it. Because at the end of the day, what this leaves us with is love is love. Thank you.